Excellent. All right. So at 3:32 p.m. on 9/17, we'll call to order this policy committee meeting. Today we will be discussing policy JKA, student discipline. So if we want to get started with that, and then.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm James Torrance. I'm the Staff Specialist for Strategy and Compliance in the Office of the Chief Academic Officer.
Good afternoon. I'm Denise Mabry, Director of Due Process in the Office of Special Education.
Today we're presenting Board Policy JKA, Behavioral Interventions and Student Discipline. Just to give you background, the Office of Student Conduct and Attendance did a revision to JKA. This revision is substantive in terms of both technical revisions, but also substantive to align to what the current state law is. And we also put in place and memorialize our current processes. In terms of it, we first will discuss the pre-K through second grade suspension limitations. The current state limitations requires that in order to suspend a student in grade bands pre-K through second grade, that we must consult a mental health professional, and the max that we can do is up to 5 days for the students. And in order for a student to be suspended, they must be in imminent threat of serious harm. That means imminent threat of serious harm to themselves or others. Also, it places a requirement on school administrators to develop and monitor interventions prior to suspension. So we're evaluating whether interventions are in place prior to that as well. In terms of state law, the state law just redefined restorative practice after this past General Assembly. This definition that we have presently on the slide is defined by the state, but is mostly incorporated in our current definition of restorative methods. They use the definition for restorative approaches, so we adapted and added things that we did not have in our current definition, because we recognize that not all of our schools have restorative practice, but they employ restorative approaches. Also, we also applied to the Technical Assistance Bulletin for restorative practices. So we saw what they put out, and we made sure that those things were incorporated into that definition. In terms of restraint and seclusion, the Office of Special Education took particular notice of this because the State Board of Education provided us with a task force. That task force released a recommendation and findings and discussed definitions in terms of restraint, physical restraints, and who can do them. We in city schools in 2017 took the proactive approach and prohibited seclusion and mechanical restraints. For proposed revisions to JKA, we revised, again, restorative practices methods to restorative practice approaches, as well as aligned it with the language from the state law. In terms of the JKA-RA, we did prohibit seclusion as well as mechanical restraints. We are doing just like other states are doing. Well, what the states are doing are banning it outright, as well as two other LEAs who have prohibited seclusion as well. In terms of JKRB, we put in place the restrictions on the pre-K through second grade suspensions and put in place the requirement for a mental health clinician to sign off on if there is an imminent threat of harm prior to suspension, and the evaluation of whether supports and interventions were used prior to suspension. As well as we removed the 59-minute limit on student removals. As in JKARB, if a student is removed from their classroom environment for more than 59 minutes, it's their first day of suspension. We recognize that our mental health professionals need time to properly evaluate our students and make the right determination, not make a rushed decision. We also clarify the language for transfers for safety and security concerns. In terms of the numbers for suspensions for students in pre-K through second grade, since the policy shifts in 2017, we've gone drastically down to 44 from 700 incidents. Note that that is incidents and not students, the number of students.
So technical revisions to the regulations, revised the name of the Office of Specialized Services to the Office of Special Education and Student Supports, We clarified the language for cumulative and consecutive days for suspensions and suggest a referral for a manifestation meeting by the IP team when the removal approaches 5 days instead of 8 days.
And to give background on that, for a long-term suspension under our policy is 4 days. So we want to make sure that we have a accountability measure in place to ensure that manifestation hearings are occurring properly, as well as for the clarification of the cumulative versus consecutive. The way that it was worded, we wanted to make sure that people knew that it is less than 10 days instead of no more than 10 days, and also 10 days or more if you're thinking about 10 days beyond the 10 consecutive time periods.
So a quick question on that, and my intent was to get all the way through this, but since you caveated it. So just about the 5 day, so when we go to slide 10, and looking at the referral approaches 5 days, but a manifest determination hearing has to happen within 4 days. So a student could conceivably be suspended for 4 days inappropriately before a hearing is held about manifestation?
Yeah, so it's not inappropriately because technically they have up to 10 days, but we're trying to get schools to hold those meetings prior to
Right,
those 10
perfect.
days.
I just wanted that.
Yes.
This
out
is
there
our
transparent.
proactive
Yeah,
approach.
Thank you.
So technical revisions to the regulations include general guidelines for students with disability, clarify the language for cumulative and consecutive days for suspension, and clarify the role of the principal designee, and clarify the start of suspension and expulsion.
Either of you have questions to start us off, or? Okay, otherwise, I've got.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the language in, I just want to highlight RA, JKRA.
Which, if anyone's
No.
following along, is the regulations document.
Yeah, but that's not the one that it's just JKA. It's just the policy document. That belief statement, I think, is a very powerful statement to guide what is happening in regards to interventions and supports for students that are challenged in the environments that they're in. I really just want to highlight that for the staff, whoever drafted this. I don't know if it was in this iteration or iterations before. I think it is a good way to guide the work that is being done. With that, with the exclusion aspect of the policy, what staff members are assigned to supervise or implement the exclusion, the temporary exclusion from the classroom? That exclusion is for 30 minutes max to be considered exclusion, correct?
Correct.
So who is responsible for that, and should that be mandated in the policy?
Right, so at each school, there should be a trained staff member who will assist with any exclusion or restraints for students. At each school, we're in a process of ensuring that there's a team of people at each school to make sure they are trained and to monitor and to record any length of time the student is away from their non-disabled peers.
What does that training look like?
So it's CPI de-escalation training. And CPI has a 2-day training for full restraints, and it's a 1-day training for just the de-escalation part. So we're asking that each school have a team of people, maybe 4, including an administrator, maybe like a social work or behavior lead, to be the leaders of that school.
Can I jump in?
Yes.
So just as a comment on that, so in the regulations, it says that the child will be referred to the principal, not to a team. So there's some alignment of language through the regulations and the policy document, where some places it says it'll be referred to a team, other places referred to the principal, and just to clarify that, and maybe even in the definitions, who is that team? And then, as you'll hear when I go through my comment, what's the professional development and training for those team members?
Yeah, I want to know. I would be interested in knowing that too. And then what happens when a student does not comply? I believe that this is still in RA in that first one. What happens to, I can't tell you specifically where because I was jotting down notes. What happens when a student doesn't comply with the community service project in response to their disruptive behavior? Is there another, something else that happens? If they don't, do they automatically receive a short-term suspension, or what happens if, because I know that there are certain interventions outlined in the policy, but with this particular intervention, what happens if a student doesn't comply with the community service aspect that the principal deems appropriate?
Right, and there's a restitution clause
Like
in there that's very similar. Yeah,
$2,500,
up to $2,500 unless it's a legal case. But there's no teeth in it for what happens if a student destroys a desk and says, I'm not paying for it.
Okay.
Oh, and I'll find it. I've got it here in my notes somewhere.
I'm just curious to know that. And then in number 8, where we have the guidelines for principal responsibilities. Letter A says that principals must identify and provide professional development, PD, for identified school staff in the areas of blah, 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 and they've been updated. Although principals are responsible for a majority of the professional development for their school staff, how is the district sharing the responsibility of that professional development to ensure holistic supports are in place for young people? It's a lot to think about a principal having to train their staff on these interventions. And so is it being shared? Yes, perhaps with the Office of Special Education, perhaps, maybe with another office within the school's office, I'm not sure. But it just, to me, would make more sense for there to be a more cohesive professional development implementation strategy for not just the principals to have to deliver that professional development, but how are we developing a continuum of development over time. With that, should trauma-informed care professional development be specified in the policy? Because I know that it is referenced, but should principals then be the sole folks responsible for ensuring that the staff within their building are receiving trauma-informed professional development to support interventions for our students that need them?
I'm just taking these questions so we can get back to you on it. I want to at least have us give a lot of thought to it before we give our response, because these are...
And another part to it is how are we as a district prepared to train principals on the implementation strategy? So I'm sure that you all have professional development plans and things in place, but I'm curious because, of course, we don't necessarily get a chance to see all the time or hear all the time how folks are being trained to deliver all of the work that everyone is, developing and working so hard to make sure is in place for our young people. So I'm curious to know how we're training principals on the implementation strategies, which is a part of my bigger questioning. Like, are we sharing it? Are principals the only folks responsible for delivering the professional development? What other folks are involved? Not that it necessarily has to be specified in policy, because that could potentially limit us in what we're able to do. But I'm curious to just know that there is a plan, and what does it look like? And it honestly seems like from me reading it, a lot for a principal to have to do within their building on top of everything else that they have to do. Professional development is a priority, but how are we sharing that with such a healthy and weighty policy for implementation? That's the first part of my questions. I have a few more, but they're not in response to that.
Sorry. For slide 8, when it says removing the 59-minute time, is there anything going to be in place with a time limit for health professionals to get back on their inference or their conclusion about the situation of the students, or are we just letting them continue off and get ready for, well, how do I phrase this? Sorry. Where it says removing the 59 time limit, and you said so that we can give school psychologists and everyone a time so that way they can have their correct conclusions. But is there a time at all, or are we just allowing them to take as much time as needed in order to come to a conclusion?
So when we thought about this 2 years ago when we were putting out the guidance and implementing, our mental health professionals told us that they diswaiver from a time limit because there might be instances where they might have to do direct counseling as well. So there's the evaluation, and there might be something that they can directly provide a resource there. So do we put 90 minutes? Do we do an hour? Is that enough time if a student's in a crisis? Is it a crisis that we can attend to right away? How do we manage that? And that's one of the things. So I can give you an idea that I've seen when we first implemented that a social worker went out and evaluated a student. Within an hour, she had her evaluation back into Dr. Fink at that time. But she also, at that same time, was making a referral to anger management services for a student. And that student wasn't suspended. So it's the time and then also consulting with her family about what the person observed as well. So
to that, there's sort of 3 times, if you look at all the documents, there's 50 minutes, 59 minutes, and 90 minutes that are in the documents. So some tightening up. The 59 minutes, as I read it, was sort of a maximum, just general, you're out of class, we got to get you back within an hour. Versus we need to send a social worker out to do either a manifestation or a one-on-one counseling session to determine next steps. Is there a way we can differentiate those two so that the average kid that's kicked out of a class because you didn't bring a pencil or you were insubordinate for some other reason has you're going to get to go to your next class kind of rule, versus that we have to send somebody from North Avenue to come do an intervention or an assessment?
So
Here.
this is more related to our primary grade. So this is for pre-K through second grade. So in these instances, we have right now our 1.0 social workers at every school. So this is a load that social workers will more than likely share because they're presently there. They can also do the same evaluation as a school psychologist. They are a mental health professional. And they would normally be involved in the environment at the school. So this is where I put it like this is where the stars align and things are aligning perfectly through our strategies, through all the things that we've done over the years.
So removing the time removes a sense of urgency, though. Is that a challenge that we see, or?
So we're examining it because the thing is that our mental health professionals still want to have some time to actually do it. And the question is, they're removing them for a mental health purpose to figure out whether or not they need to put an intervention in place. But if there aren't any interventions in place and we suspend them, there's 2 different. So if I'm providing a service to you, then technically there is, and you're not being suspended, there is no removal. Whereas if I'm providing if I'm disciplining you, there is a removal. That counts as a removal. So we're just trying to make sure that there is enough discretion at that time that we don't mirror the 2 and then mistakenly have a removal.
Is your question about clarity? Is there sufficient clarity between when? What?
So my question is very specific about the non-504, non-IEP kid that gets sent to the office or something, or to a behavior room or wherever. Is there sort of a maximum time frame before we're inhibiting your right to a free and public education?
So
Which I think was Commissioner Lynn's question essentially too, is that if you get rid of the 59 minutes, is there some other way to?
So for this grade band, it applies to all students, whether you have an IEP or you're in gen ed or you have a 504 plan. For that grade band, for the grade band pre-K through second grade, we only removed it for pre-K through second grade.
So then that needs to be really specific in the policy, because it reads now like it's removed for everybody when I read it.
Okay.
So it reads now like you could just warehouse somebody in the office for the day.
We'll clarify it because we made sure that we maintain, so what we
Or
did.
that's how I read it, could be
Yeah.
my issue.
I mean, it's a good point, is that like you said, there's different time parameters for different situations, and so that's a lot. So it gets to making sure that it's written clearly in the policy, as well as to making sure that the way we're communicating in guidance and training to folks is clear, because it's a lot to navigate at the school level in an emergency when you're trying to figure out what you're gonna do.
So I'll throw out a philosophical overarching one, and then we'll toss back out. But just throughout the policy and all the regulation documents, it focuses on restorative practices as the front leaning. The challenge with me with that, I apologize, yes. And there's several that are still say restorative practices, so there's some language, again, clarifying with throughout, so that's the same. But restorative is a forensic look. It is something was broken. So again, it's a reactionary policy rather than a proactive, preventative, de-escalating, making sure that there's the right interventions as opposed to modifications and the PD behind that. So I'm just wondering if, once again, we're not setting students up for, well, this is going to be your punishment versus this is the natural consequence for an inappropriate action, and not putting enough of the emphasis on how are we teaching, how are we enforcing behavior or reinforcing behavior, how are we helping kids learn to self-regulate so that nothing needs to be restored. Does that make sense? It feels like it's but just using restorative approaches feels reactionary.
I'm torn because I'm also a conflict management professional from the other end. So I'm a mediator, and then I have my master's is in conflict management. So restorative practices is both reactionary and both proactive to me. So for a teacher who's learning your students and is noticing different behavior, you can use the restorative method approaches to earn information from the student and show them restorative practices goes in hand with positive behavioral intervention. So I'll give an example of my nephew. So if I see that he's doing a behavior that is not technically something I should discipline him for, but I know that it can escalate to that behavior, I'm asking him questions and getting him to understand it that way. So that's two approaches. That's the proactive approach, but there's also the restorative approach where you've done a wrong, and I have to help you understand how the person that you wronged or the community that you wronged has perceived it, and how we can agree to move forward without having that wrong happen. So philosophically, it's two different. It's a duality.
Yeah, and I think you get that. I think we get that. I'm not sure that's translated in the language of the policy to the teacher,
Okay.
who may not be vested in this work as we are. It reads like, well, I don't have to do anything until there's a behavior, and then I will react and respond, versus proactive planning and culturally relevant pedagogies and trauma responsive care and all of those other pieces that come as front load.
Right. Well, or in a restorative practice at school, there should be regular circles so that you have relationships with students, and those circles are times where you build relationships, you know what's going on with your students, you're identifying potential issues and so on. So that's a preventative aspect of it, but it's not required in the policy, and not all schools are doing that. So then in the schools where we're not doing that, or we're not doing it in every classroom and every day, how are you getting that preventative way of knowing what's going on with students before?
Okay.
So I know you guys said that from pre-K to second grade, we removed the 59 limit, but for the third grade through up, we still have the 59-minute time limit, correct? Okay. And are there in instances where, if there are third grade and above incidences, is a school psychologist intervened into that conversation, or is it just in the hands of the principal, whatever they see is fit? Because here it says that the pre-K through second grade, they're not allowed to suspend without a psychologist present and their conclusion is made, but what about third grade and up?
So third grade up, we have the state limitation for that grade band, but it's also up to the school leader about where they want to approach it. So there might be a school leader, instead of suspending your student, may have a restorative practice in their school, and they'll do a restorative practice circle, or they may have mindfulness. They may send a student to their mindfulness coordinator or the person in that room, So it's different. So one of the things is that there are certain things by law that we have to suspend for. And then there are certain instances where this at the discretion of the school leader on how to help the student regulate that behavior.
So after an incident where a student is suspended, let's say, and they come back to school, is there anywhere in the regulation or anything that says that school psychologists or mental health professionals will then come in and then assess the student based on if they see anything that, there's anything that lingers around or that they need to have restorative approaches to better themselves, I guess. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So I'll put a link to this in the threat assessment. So if it's case in point, if it's a low risk threat and it's a fight between two students, and there might be and I suspend you, there might be a reason for me to have the social worker provide a referral to conflict management or a referral to a psychologist. So there's different instances. So with this, I like to keep it away from the discipline lens, because after they're returning, the lens should be about what supports I have in place to prevent this from happening, and that's where that threat assessment piece comes in. What supports do we have in place to prevent the behavior from happening and occurring again?
So to that end, I have a request that in the definitions, that we define consequences and punishment, and that we add language throughout the preamble and things that we're looking at, consequences that align to behaviors that are appropriate versus punishment. And I'm a little challenged just on a philosophical level, I know we need to, but how an imminent threat is still imminent after 10 days of suspension is as far as a punishment versus a consequences conversation. If we're really providing the skills and investment, and when I say investment, I mean that, say we've got an 8-year-old who has, who has threatened something egregious, I'm gonna blow you up, Commissioner McFadden.
Please don't.
I won't, but I'm suspended now for 8 days, and I come back in, and yes, there's a mandatory conference with the teacher and a reentry things, but was it really 8 days that I needed to de-escalate from that? Or is it a shorter time? Yes, it was an egregious hint at, but people say silly things all the time. And people attempt to do horrible things all the time. But is 10 days going to make a difference? Or is it about what happens during those 10 days that matters more?
I will definitely look into that. We're actually meeting with the discipline advocates on this actual policy, so we might actually ask for technical assistance in actually making that definition, because I can tell you that my heart says the legal definition, but in terms of the actual background of someone who's in a school, who's been a person who has the power to suspend, their definition between consequence and punishment may be different from mine.
And to that, when we get into the guidelines under inappropriate behavior, giving some examples, as someone who's served in a dean of students role, that, having gum in a class, not bringing your pencil to a class, cursing. A lot of teachers would say that's inappropriate and want to send a kid out for it. What's the professional development? How are we tracking, the high flyers of teachers who are sending people out and referring people? And not on a punitive, evaluative way, but on you need some coaching or some implicit bias or some racial equity training. So we're identifying and targeting differentiated professional development needs based on the ability or inability to redirect, provide accommodations and modifications in a classroom.
I had a clarifying question. Does this policy only pertain to outside suspension or as well as in-school suspension?
There's references to in-school suspension.
Okay.
Both in-school and out-of-school suspension are in there.
Okay. Commissioner McFadden?
Thank you. So I can't remember which section it's in, but it deals with the guidelines with in-school suspension for grades 3 through 12. Can we talk about in-school suspension? I'd like to talk about it. For example, under guidelines, so does every school have an in-school suspension program? That is one of my questions that I would like to know today. And In letter A, it says the removal of any student from, oh, that's another thing. The language in A just specifies his, and it isn't his or her or their or each student. It is very specific to his, so I think it's just an oversight, but it is there. I'm flagging it. Should always be the disciplinary action of last resort, yes. The principal has the authority to remove a student from his current instructional, and there's his again, or from their current instructional program to an in-school suspension setting for up to 3 school days. Why is it limited to 3 school days? So I know that we want to maximize the instructional time, for our young people, for our students. But I don't know if the student is, and I want to have dialogue about it and just hear what folks are thinking about it. If a student is in the school setting, perhaps it is the student isn't, there's some dynamic within a particular class that is challenging the student, and the student doesn't want to be in that particular class. Perhaps the in-school suspension, there was something that was done and there has to be some consequences for that student. But in the interim, perhaps that student may need a schedule change. I don't know, there could be several factors that go into that, but why do we limit the amount of time that a student is in an in-school suspension room? Could there be supports provided? I know that some of my past experiences, department chairs within a school building supply within an in-school suspension room content-specific assignments. They align whatever is happening in, for example, I'm thinking about real experience. If a student goes to an in-school suspension setting in our school, teachers are required to provide the in-school suspension facilitator or staff member with assignments that are relative to the objective and the standards that are being taught specifically. Granted, it is not that specified teacher, but there are several ways that an in-school suspension program can be done. So why do we limit it to 3 days? And should we specify what is happening in the in-school suspension program? I think that's important. So it's those 3 things that I think I'm asking. Are there in-school suspension programs in every school? Why are we limiting the in-school suspension requirement to 3 days? And then what is actually occurring in the in-school suspension space? If our staff members are trained in trauma-informed pedagogy and care, are there some restorative approaches taking place in the in-school suspension room? Should we specify that prior to a student returning back to their normal instructional setting? I would like more clarity around that, because I would hate for an in-school suspension room to become a place where students are babysat, or it becomes even more
Of an incentive?
or even just an issue. Like, we don't want them to lose instructional time if they're still in the school building. So should we be specifying that policy, which is the trick question, which I'm not sure that we should be, but I don't know. So, which is why I'm curious to know what everyone is thinking about it.
Well, and on a dovetail to that, at one point in the regulations, it says that the student will be sent to the principal's office. Is that the best practice? Or should there be a behavior room in the school that we say, that's designated so that the student isn't up front seeing what the whole scoop is going on and everybody coming and going, because that incentivizes out of the classroom time?
And that could also align to exclusion, right? So if a student is excluded for a temporary period of time, I did see within the policy there are some stipulations for what the room and the environments are supposed to be like for students that are excluded. So that is fine, but to Dr. James Hassan's point, if a student is sent to the principal's office and not to an exclusionary setting, is the principal's office an exclusionary setting? So, yes, I agree with that. But the in-school suspension piece, I'm really curious to know more about that and how it is handled within city schools.
So Lori Hines is not here, but I will follow up with her about the answer to that because she is in charge of suspensions. I will tell you from my understanding of what a student's supposed to receive is they are supposed to receive anything as though as they were suspended outside of their program. So they would have to receive work packets. They would have to receive those things. They would have to get that due process as well while they're in that room. So those things I do know. The question is how many are there? What other things are provided? And does every school have one? And that's a question I have to ask her, and I don't want to give you the wrong answer.
And if a student is in school, ideally, right, this should not just be busy work that a student is doing while they're in an in-school suspension setting. It should still be, a line, yes, they're removed because this is now a consequence for your egregious behavior, right? But we also have to make sure that you're still in school so that you're learning. I think that is important, so I appreciate that.
And I would take that to one level further and say, what about out-of-school suspensions? And what kind of work are, so within, say, just using wit and wisdom as a general, ideally, are we developing sort of scope and sequence overview packets, for lack of a better word, that if you're a third grader and you're suspended or have an extended suspension between September and November, this is the packet you get to keep you up to date with where the rest of the curriculum is tracking. If you're a fifth grader, this is where it goes. So we're not losing more time. So many times kids that are disruptive because they're already behind. So sending them home is doubling down on their behindedness. And so how are we working to mitigate that?
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify while I'm taking notes, I just want to make sure I got this correctly. You want to know about the scope and sequence for out-of-school suspensions and whether we can align it to our current curriculum in terms of packets.
Whether it's packets, whether it's technologically supported curriculum, whether it's homeschool help, whether it's meet at the community center and, we're going to do this day lesson for everybody that's out, that's in your community. I don't know the answer, but it feels like a question that needs to be considered at least.
And to that also, please just hear my thoughts right now. But being in the digital age and thinking about being progressive, are there alternatives, digital alternatives for students to be engaged with outside of school if they're suspended? So I know that there is a lot to think about that. They may not have access to technology outside of school, but is it an option so that we are still growing the capacity of their cognitive ability? I think that's important. In JKRB, in the guidelines for short-term suspensions for students in grades 3 through 12, it just stuck out for me. I'm not savvy with the language in regards to the law. But number 4 within Roman numeral 4 under guidelines, then there is number 4. The principal is to explain to the student that she or he has lost the right to attend school. That was major for me because I didn't know if we could take the right away from a student to attend school. Maybe we can if they're
Federal law.
Okay, so that's a federal law.
Every child is required.
I'm asking, like in the language in this, are we saying that you no longer have the right to be educated, or you may have lost? I don't know what this is Roman numeral 4 and JKARB. It's an RB. So Roman numeral 4 under guidelines, and it is number 4 under Roman numeral 4. And just that first sentence, the principal is going to explain to the student that she or he has lost the right to attend school, be on school property, and to attend school-sponsored activities during the period of suspension. So I want to say that I understand the intent of what this means, but that language, I think words have power, especially in regards to this being a living, breathing document. So should we consider an alternative to saying that that a student has lost the right to attend school? Do we have that ability? And I'm honestly asking, because I'm not clear. However, the suspended student may return to the school premises to attend a previously scheduled appointment, not to include extracurricular or sports activities, if the principal authorizes it in advance. The authorization must be in writing and for a specific purpose, and a copy provided to the student and his or her parent. So what was just glaring for me was that first sentence, which was the right. So I'm not sure where we are with that, and if it can be amended based on law or
Time period or something.
Well, and especially with due process, that no due process has happened at that point. So you might have lost the privilege of being in that school that day.
but the right is very strong.
And can we add guardian? Sorry, parent and or guardian. That
So I'm curious to know more about that. I mean, once you all get it. And then finally, usually, with a lot of the policies that are presented in draft that come through committee, there is this section that talks about engagement. And I think that it is very important to at least hear about what engagement has looked like outside of this particular building, or with organizations or community members or stakeholders that are directly impacted by a policy like this. I am very happy and thrilled that Commissioner Lynn sits on this policy. I'm not sure if we've ever had a student to be on a committee like this before. So his input is very vital and crucial to the development of policies like these. But outside of Commissioner Lynn, perhaps it was ASCBC reached out to, or maybe other student groups or organizations that this directly impacts. And of course, principals, the principals and administrators, teachers, related service providers, how were parents certainly, how would they engage? Because I do know that, the BTU had a work group around the code of conduct. So how does that engagement or that process align to the revisions of this policy? I'm curious to know that.
So the goal is to get to everyone as possibly as we can. So one of the things is that PCAP is already on the radar for coming to PCAP, CCAC. We also want to go to SBCA. I'm sorry. Oh my God, I keep getting the acronym.
ASCBC.
ASB.
The Associated Student
Student
Congress.
Congress
They're very
of
unique, by the way, because they're like the only group.
I'm sorry. Get to them as well, but we also want to arrange this for students because this does affect them. This is their rights. We also want to make sure that we got to the advocates too, because to think about the lens of this, it's hard, especially I have a legal background, so I think about what is a right, what is your due process and the things of reading this document. So it's just going back through it again and then finding these things makes us get a tooth comb, sorry. Tongue-tied it today. But also we will I will tell you here that if there's one thing that I've learned from during engagement, I'm a regular at PCAB, a regular CCAC, but I also want to make sure that we get out there. Just a few moments ago, I talked to Commissioner Lynn about doing implementation strategy for student clubs policy. We want to actively make sure we get this out there so students can actually have their input on it as well.
And I think with the idea that it's a digital age, like Commissioner McFadden said, I think it's a little bit easier for communication to get out to students. But just the difficulty, I don't even think it's about getting out to students. I think the difficulty is getting them intrigued into it. And I think the idea is that we have to come to an approach where it's not, oh, here's a policy, read it. I think it needs to come from an approach of, this is something that will actually impact your life in a school system, and you should severely know what it is about. So I don't think that it's about just giving it to them, because some students are aware. I just think it's also about communicating it to them, making sure they understand what the policy is actually about, because I do think a lot of students can get, mixed up on certain things within policies because they don't read policies on a regular day basis. But, so yes, that's one of the things that ASCBC as well as multitude of other organizations, student organizations that we're working with. So we're trying to figure out an idea to condense this into something smaller, but also very impactful for students. So
So I put it like this. When I did the outreach for student clubs, I told students that this is about your rights and how you want your rights to be defined in policy. And I think that's where we're giving the students the agency to give input. Because when they know that they have power, they tend to give more in-depth input and very honest input about what that power looks like for them.
So are some of those meetings, like is PCAP, is it scheduled yet?
So we're scheduling them now. So we're actually scheduling. So the thing is that from looking at the readers, there's like at least 4 weeks in between them. So we're trying to make sure we actually get out there and actually get information in back from people. So typically with our advocates, they give us a line by line, like you should change this. We also have a meeting with them. So the thing is to also have the opportunity for students as well. So, hey, we've met with you. These are the things that you've suggested to us. This is what we've gotten back. Or we giving you a response why we didn't accept those changes and allowed you to understand, like, through the policy process, you're an active participant.
Commissioner Brooks, did you want to jump in here? You good?
Here is, when does this come up for first reader? Because depending on when it does come up, here's an idea.
October 22nd.
Here's an idea that just came to me. What if we solicited principals in perhaps each of the geographic locations of the city, north, south, east, and west, and did maybe a small focus group with groups of students in each of those schools between now and second reader? I mean, October 22nd is soon, but I think it could be an interesting way to get feedback and to go to the students perhaps during the school day. A principal, may be able to release a few students to just engage in conversation. Perhaps Commissioner Lynn or members from ASCBC, if they're making straight A's and they can afford, so you see what I'm saying, some time, maybe they could accompany you all in that listening session to actually kind of hear what students think about it, especially versus bringing them to this building and space, because I think it would actually be better to be in their spaces while they're actually in a normal instructional day, and even get an opportunity to speak to the principals also, who could be a part of the group, to provide their input juxtaposed with the students' input to kind of inform more of the wonderful work that you all have been doing with this policy.
I like that idea.
Just to piggyback off of that, ASCBC has actually been communicating with member schools to start something where their student government would have once a month a day where in the beginning it's like a little general assembly during the day, so that way attendance can be high, and just give out certain things that the district or themselves they have important messages to give out. A lot of principals have been respectful and actually like the idea, so I don't think that would be a problem. So I think if you could, as long as you do your organization and you hand it out to whoever you do, you can also hand it out to ASCBC and we'll distribute it to the schools that have already started this process. They are having some trial runs actually next month, so it'll be good to do that as well. Just the idea of that, just to keep that in mind.
Now, Commissioner Lynn, you are not the president of ASCBC.
I am not.
But when is the first General Assembly?
November.
That's a good question. The first General Assembly is actually in 2 weeks.
So I'm not sure what schedules look like, but perhaps a part of the conversation could begin in that ASCBC General Assembly. I don't know if staff will be available to support that meeting, at least for a portion, to just give an overview of what is being presented to the board as far as JKA is concerned, and start soliciting that feedback in that particular group, because we love those student leaders and all of our student leaders. But as a formalized student group, I think that could be a place to start.
We can definitely reach out to the advisor.
Anything else? Okay, I have a few. First off, there's several references to all students, and we're moving towards each student. So just a wordsmithing piece there. In the policy document under definitions, letter DD, again, says sending them to the office. If you've got a student who is, for whatever reason, in a behavioral space where they need to leave the room, having them go unescorted seems to me like a challenging opportunity for all sorts of things to happen. So we pay hall monitors at high schools and middle schools. Just tightening up, what's the process? If you want to send someone out of your room, how do we make sure they're safe and they're supervised, and they have the systems around them to make sure that they don't escalate? Also under definitions, there's nothing stating there, so there's all these reasons for removal and whatnot. So I would love it to see a crosswalk with the wellness policy in the definitions, just to remind folks that people cannot be removed from recess or physical education for academic or behavioral reasons, so that is different than this. If they're removed from school, that's one thing, but that a teacher cannot take away recess because of behavior or academic reasons. So just an informal, this dovetails with this other policy in this respect.
So adding to the removal definition, those
Correct.
things.
Just
Okay, I
a
just wanted-
reminder that we have this other policy that says that you can't take away recess for behavior or academic reasons unless it's behavior at recess, just to be clear. Because I see that you go into classrooms around the city and it's your first behavioral strike is this, your second behavioral strike because we're taking away recess. It's like, that's against policy. Of the CEO designee, so are there credentials or training requirements of that person? And similarly with the principal in the building, when they can designate someone to be on the intervention team, or just, what are the credentials and training responsibilities requirements minimum for someone to be involved in this? Again, in the definitions, including something consequences versus punishment, making sure that we're really clear that we're looking at natural and appropriate consequences versus looking to just be punitive, because what we're looking to do is get kids redirected and back on track so they can participate. In the policy document under Roman numeral level 5, it says, again, any other appropriate person. So is that throughout the documents and the regulations, we also interchange the word counsel versus representative as far as what the student needs with them to appeal, the due process things, and that dovetails with both threat assessments and policy, is it BLA maybe? But again, those three things, any other person, counsel, and representative, are interchanged in a way that I think would be problematic for families to navigate. BLC, that's the other one. So under the policy document, under Roman numeral 5, letter D, it says about other relevant policies. So listing what are those other relevant policies and even putting a live link so that families who are looking to comply with due process on timelines and appeals, which goes to the appeals policy we talked about last month, having an actual, because these are all digitally displayed, having an actual live link so a parent or family can click directly to see what the appeals process is. Under the policy document, Roman numeral number 5, implementation strategies, letter A says administrators must keep in mind the need for age-appropriate consequences when determining sanctions for code violations. What about developmentally appropriate? For both our students with special needs as well as our students who may not be identified. And again, that goes to reinforcing the fact that this is consequences and not punishment. Also under Roman numeral 5 of implementation strategies, letter B, sorry if I'm going too fast, let me, about privacy. So letter B is all about if a student is charged with a serious crime, they can be removed from school. We have an innocent till proven guilty and is charged enough of a challenge, especially if it's something outside of school, to remove a child from classes. And what is the documentation around that and accountability for, and documentation and accountability are gonna come through all of my comments, whether it's, have we documented what interventions have been in place, for how long, were they effective, what subsequent interventions were put in place, and having a way to report that out, rather than simply a teacher. We have great teachers, don't get me wrong, who says, well, I tried everything, there's nothing else I can do. Well, what exactly did you try? And was it actually an intervention, or was it a modification accommodation? Well, I moved them to the front of the room. That's not an intervention. So how are we doing professional development around this to ensure that interventions are actually interventions, that they're being documented prior to? And that then it was big with the crime, accused of a crime outside. I'm not sure that we can do that even in schools. So that's problematic. Also, if you look, there's a intersection there with what state law says on our compliance with reportable offense laws. So again, my interventions piece. Do we, in that section on implementation strategies, also maybe need a letter F? And this is going to sound counter to something I'm going to say later, but there's nothing in this document about accurate and honest reporting and data collection on in-school, out-of-school suspensions. To say that, yes, we keep saying our suspension data is going down, but how many kids are being told, you know what, you should probably just go sick today, or, can you stay home tomorrow? And those sort of informal removals from school, some teeth in how that's documented, so we can accurately track. And especially if the child is going to come back from an extended suspension and be put in an alternate placement. So I don't know if that's capacity. So the place where I said it was going to be counter is there's a couple things later on that talk about principals' responsibilities, but policies with a J are supposed to be student-focused. So is there another adult policy that this needs to be fleshed out in?
Quick question for the compliance portion.
You bet.
The crosswalk of reportable offenses, are those the code for the suspension, or is that are we referring to a criminal offense? I just want to clarify.
So in how I read it in letter B was that a student who is where am I? Accused of a crime in the criminal justice system can be removed from school for danger. I'm not sure we can hold in-school accountability for not proven guilty charges in the criminal system.
Okay. I just want to make sure which offenses.
Now,
you're
it very
referring
well might be a scenario where it is very really a very real and pertinent threat, but it feels like simply being accused of a crime in the criminal system shouldn't have a school consequence. As far as restricting your legal access and affordability to a free public education. In JKRA, so it says in the purpose statement that the purpose is to establish procedures for classroom management and behavioral interventions rooted in restorative practices, again, so that's one of those wordsmith, rooted in restorative practice methods that are designed to maintain a safe and positive learning environment. Is that really our purpose? And I ask that not to make a mountain out of a molehill, but if a policy's purpose is to establish classroom procedures and management, or is the policy to maximize a safe learning environment for students, period? And from there, we get different regulations, perhaps. Some of the classroom management things come out in the regulations. But it seems like the purpose is watering down and redistributing the accountability and responsibility for the actions that are going to need to take place to create a safe learning environment for each student. just a random question under, again, RA, Roman numeral, under guidelines. It says that this policy has to be posted on websites for schools that have them. Do we have schools without websites? If so, we should probably address that.
Our website identifies a school profile and then connects to the school's website if they have them. But our old platform supported websites for schools, and the range of how updated they were varied greatly. And so now we connect to a website if they have an active website. But there are schools that have, kind of just pages, and then some who have much more robust websites.
So as in our website revision, are we working on fixing that as far as?
So the way we fixed it basically is because we can't really, the amount of work it takes to upgrade 171 websites and keep them up to date with information that we don't have,
Right.
that's at schools is pretty daunting. So that's why we created a different platform where we have a central website with profile information and try to have videos and information essentially on schools that we can keep up to date, and then we'll connect to their website if there's a website that they want to connect to.
Hopefully, as we're looking at student recruitment and retention and,
If you go through the school choice page, there's a lot of information about each school,
Mm-hmm.
the profile, and like I said, we try to have videos and so on that we hold centrally, but individual schools may have a lot more than that than on their websites, but it varies a lot, and schools have a wide range of capacity on that. To keep that up to date in terms of what activities they have, what calendar events they have, but we don't have that information centrally.
okay. So if they don't have a website, then is there language in the policy on how we're disseminating information? Or how we ensure that, say, if a student is suspended, that they get a list and the due process rights are in every single communication that comes to them, and timelines and things like that. So I think if we're not going to say that everybody's got a website and this is where you can look and this is the icon that you look for, then how do we ensure that's
You
in
can
written
certainly look at our
communication?
website. I mean, that could be a good linking to
Right,
our own
so a link
information.
to the central website or something. It just feels like saying, if they have one, we're going to tell you. If they don't have one, we're not going to tell you.
Okay.
So yeah, in that section, I just have a lot of how are we communicating with families. Letter J, do we need a letter J under guidelines on training and professional development? So
Where are you?
I'm on JKA-RA under guidelines. So it's things like the definition of consequence, the use of community services as consequence, or community service, restorative practice methods.
Which guidelines? For which one?
RA, I believe.
Yeah,
Yes,
they are.
under RA.
Is it-
This is before inappropriate behavior. The general guidelines, sorry. Yep.
Are you asking if we should add a J?
Yeah, I'm just saying, again, throughout, there's not a lot about training and professional development. And it seemed like if it was going to fit, that would be the place that it would fit. But again, it's a J policy, which is a student-centered policy. So is it actually a need for an adult policy related to this? And I don't know that. So then we go to guidelines under inappropriate behavior. I feel like that section, again, could use some examples, because are we talking about, I'm a teacher and I think it's inappropriate that you rock back on your chair. I think it's inappropriate that you're chewing gum. It's against our rules. Could that possibly escalate to something like a suspension? According to this, it seems like it could, if the teacher deems it inappropriate. And then within inappropriate, in section 4, under disruptive A6, and I'm not actually going there, I'm just using that as a referral. It says that consistency should matter, and it doesn't, but that doesn't present throughout. When in guidelines under inappropriate behavior, letter A, there's nothing about a child's study team, RTI team, SSI, who should be involved, what happens before an inappropriate behavior leads to a long-term or an extended suspension. And again, within inappropriate behavior as well as under disruptive, how do we document the interventions in place? How many, how long? Do you need to, if it's inappropriate behavior, do you need to try 3 different interventions over a period of at least a week each? Do you try 1 for a day? Do you try 6 an hour? What's best practice there? When I work with my pre-service teachers, I ask them to think about every time a student misbehaves, or to think not, wow, why can't that student control themselves, but, ooh, what did I forget to teach? And so some of this documenting of interventions, what did I forget to help them figure out how to do? Did I teach them how to sit on a chair? Or am I just kicking them out because they're rocking back in it? So it, again, feels like there's a lot of onus of responsibility solely on the misbehaving child. And I don't, yes, we have to stop misbehavior, but we also have to figure out how to do this more proactively and more responsively to need. Again, throughout, what's the professional development, disability awareness, racial equity training for teachers, principals, the team. Letter B, under inappropriate behavior, says the schools should do this. Well, who in the school? And as far as what it says that they should be referred, the student should be referred to external counseling and supports as needed. Do we have a district sort of 2-on-1 kind of number? Do we have a pamphlet that says social emotional services, housing services, food services, a link to the Maryland Family Network, things like that we can have as a one-pager to give to families? Because if the school should refer the student to appropriate community resources, where do they find them? How do we make sure that they're there? What's the follow-up on that? Also under that session, do we need a letter C? Again, under inappropriate behavior. And in that letter C, that's something like school-wide data will be collected. And teachers found to be most frequently referring will receive appropriate positive coaching and professional development on interventions and modifications to support student success.
Just go back to we do require a resource list for students who are suspended. So I can have us review that resource list to make sure those things are on there.
Perfect, thank you.
I just wanted to let you know, we do provide a resource list for families when a student is suspended, whether it's short-term, long-term, or expulsion.
And in that, and in every communication, are the sort of milestone moments in the due process?
I will have to check with Lori about it, but I do know we do, and we also offer it in native language too. That is one of the requirements we do. It has to be in native language, and they have to be provided with this list.
And then under guidelines for disruptive behavior, letter A, number 2, it says the principal will consider appropriate resolutions to address the disruptive behavior, including but not limited to student conferences, parent outreach. In that, again, it says nothing about what the teacher, what's this disruptive behavior? What were the de-escalation? What were the interventions? Is it chronic? Was it one time? Because all of those will possibly trigger different responses. And again, that may not be necessary to be in the regulations, but it's one of those things when we toss it off after regulations, if it's not there, then implementation gets fuzzy from site to site. Under letter A, number 3, it feels like that needs some due process. When is it happening? How is it happening? And then number 6 and 7 in there, offering a dual pathway. So it's appropriate to treat students with atypical development and have an 504 differently, but once they go to the student studies team versus a student without a disability has different CEO appeal rights, are they pathwayed differently for alternative setting placements? So if a student with a 504 or an IEP is found to be engaging in disruptive behavior, they go to their SST to be considered for an alternative placement. A student who doesn't have a 504 or an IEP has the access, as I'm reading it, to appeal to the CEO, where the student with special needs does not, an alternative placement. And does that need to be aligned so that appeals are equitable across designation of disability or non-designation of disability?
Can we go back to number 3?
We can.
Number 3 and number 4 in that same section. What is actually happening with the consultation with principal and teacher? So it just says, prior to the student's readmission to class, the principal must consult with the teacher. What are they consulting about? Is it best practices? Is it strategies to support the student? Is it we've referred the student to Hope Health Services and we want to get them some? What happens there? I don't know if it should be specified here, but I'm just curious to know. And then that aligns to number 4. After the consultation happens, the principal may arrange conferences with appropriate support staff to assist in implementing appropriate classroom strategies and interventions. Should number 4 be before number 3? Like, should the arrangement of conferences and appropriate support staff happen prior to the principal is consulting with the teacher to say, the kid's getting ready to come back, the student's coming back, and these are the supports that we put in place to receive them when they're back. And in the event that they're in a crisis or if they need additional support, these are the strategies or the programs that we're going to implement for that student.
Developing of what the conferences and supports are is dependent on the conference with the teacher, the consultation with the teacher.
So that has to happen first, you think?
That's, I mean, I think that's the purpose of the consulting with the teacher. For the teacher who knows the student better than the principal does, should know the teacher better, the student better, would be advising on what kind of supports would.
But this behavior is disruptive, so there's already a trend happening prior to this. I'm thinking realistically, like, so I agree with you, and it makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah, so to me, when I ask how and when on that one, as a teacher who sends a kid out for some reason, and it means that we've gone through A to F, maybe W on options on how we can correct in the classroom. The principal's gonna have a consultation with me to bring them back. Are they gonna interrupt my class again? And I've gotta step out to talk to this principal to readmit the student if they come back in 5, 10, 15 minutes, which is ideal to get them back in class. Or does that consultation have to wait till we have a break, in which case the kid has to sit out longer so that I have a break when we can have a conversation for them to come back in? Or, as I've seen far too often, the principal steps in and has the conversation in front of the student and the entire rest of the class. Can Ronald come back into your class? We've talked about things. So just setting some parameters or best practices for the readmission to class conversation. And again, not sure if that goes in policy or if that's an implementation, but it's certainly something to flag for your professional development on implementation.
Yeah, I mean, and in some places so I think this is referring to when it's the principal that's involved, but there would be instances as well when the student may not be referred to the principal, like in our wholeness sites, where they might be going to the wholeness room to engage with the wholeness specialist. That's a different set of, that's kind of a lower level as to avoid this.
In the language, it says referred to the principal, though, so that needs.
So this is referring to a situation where it's referred to the principal, but then there are also situations where they're referred to a wholeness site. I don't think it necessarily needs to be in here because it's different than what this is describing, but I'm just flagging that in those situations too. I think one area that related to this we have to think about is that what is the transition back into the classroom, because they go to meet with the wholeness specialist, they maybe work on issues, work on their own de-escalation, but then if they go back in and the teacher is still not ready to receive them, then that is sometimes when we see challenges. And so that is.
And I think it speaks to Dr. James Hassan's point about who is the team. And specifying perhaps members of the team that would support that student. And in where we are as a system with our wholeness sites, intensified, thank you. we do have wholeness specialists there, but we also have social workers in our schools and other professionals. So who is a part of the team, which would be separate from the SST process, right? But what is the team to help provide these supports and interventions for the students?
And what I meant was, throughout the document, it doesn't, it's just simply referred to the principal. So it needs to be referred to the appropriate group in the school or the designated person.
I guess, I'm still thinking out loud about this. Does it need to, or is this about, that's more about preventing it becoming a disciplinary issue. That's about providing support to students to do their own, figure out what their own de-escalation tactic is. Sometimes students are referring themselves to that they're deciding that they need a moment. And so that seems a little different than this, and it's preventive before you get to this.
Right, but in the section under inappropriate behavior, it says the student will be referred to the principal, period. So do we need to, with the exception of student wholeness sites, or, yeah, go ahead, Jim.
So just to give a little context, only the school administrator can discipline technically by just policy and law. So I think that's why that references to the principal, just to get the understanding why it said that. So it's either the principal or their designee who is a administrator who is assistant principal, just to give that context.
What I'm saying is that this is not, the wholeness site is not disciplinary.
Yeah.
That's what makes it different.
Well, and that's my point overarching on the whole thing, is that the policy shouldn't be disciplinary necessarily. It should be about consequences, it shouldn't be about punishment. Which I agree, and I understand legally that, the person needs an administrative license and credentials to be able to suspend. But if we're going to lean into wholeness, behavior intervention spaces, de-escalation opportunities, manifestation determination kind of things, then maybe there needs to be more wiggle allowed in the who, when a child is asked to leave the room, are they referred to? Because that says principal as well in there. They'll be removed to the principal. And we want options there for whatever, for other places so it doesn't have to go sort of 0 to 60.
This is with those other strategies, like the wholeness strategy.
And
Wholeness rooms specifically and wholeness specialists.
And what the reality is on how many of our wholeness specialists are grant supported. Are we going to, are we creating a policy with, if those grants go away and there aren't those people in those buildings, that then we are, out of compliance because of that. So I don't, it's a little bit, this one's really hard because it's so much about management and trying to set it up for a positive.
Well, again, a lot of this is about meeting, correct me if I'm wrong, James, about meeting legal requirements with regards to disciplinary actions around which there are a lot of rules and COMAR regulations around. So that's what a lot of this is about, but then underneath that, there's also a whole guidance about other approaches to creating a more positive school environment, creating more opportunities for students to self-refer or to address their own needs through support through other individuals in the school that's not necessarily before it gets to a disciplinary action. We're trying to avoid it getting to this point.
Right.
But I don't know that goes into the discipline policy, maybe go into guidance documents and training.
Commissioner Brooks, did you want to jump in? Commissioner Brooks, any final? No, you're good? Okay. All right, well, this is a heavy lift. I am 100% sure our advocates are watching and will jump in and be contacting you if they haven't already. I did reach out to several social studies teachers and encourage them to have their students, so hopefully there's students out there paying attention to this that will also send feedback. You can send it to policy@bcps.k12.md.us. And we'll get that feedback that way, so, yes.
If you, James, end up joining the sessions at the schools,
Invite you.
yeah, let me know. I'm curious because I would like to, if I'm able to come to some of them to listen.
I will reach out to Mr. Bailey before I leave today for that.
Perfect.
And then also, it speaks throughout the documents to positive behavior interventions and supports in various orders of those words. But just to make it really clear that we are not necessarily married to a particular purchasable design, curriculum, framework, but that we'll be looking PBIS. That even though it says positive behaviors, interventions. And
So-
then in the next word says supports, that it's not necessarily, that we're not policying PBIS. We're policying the actual words of positive behavior.
There's a reason why it's lowercase.
Right. But we may want, just given because of the similarity of language, to be very clear that even in the definition sections, that positive supports include appropriate, but no particular.
Vendor. So
Vendored product.
we've done that because we make sure that it's lowercase for restorative practice because that's trademark and is directly to restorative practice. PBIS also defined in like Comar and some places. It's also lowercase because that refers to that lowercase, not the uppercase, where is
Right.
a vendor or a business.
But maybe just putting that in the definitions,
Yeah,
just
just
to
a
be
disclaimer that we're
transparent.
not a vendor.
Because what I would not want us to do as a board is pass a policy that is connected to a vendor. Because that would be challenging. Okay. All right. Anything else? We go to the group? Okay, no, thank you very much. Appreciate it. It'll be fun to watch this one come back around. And I'm sure we will find all sorts of things we haven't found when we get our input from our experts in the community. So we are now on public comment. Do we have anyone? No? Okay, as is our practice, as we're getting used to public comment, since we have time, is there anyone in the gallery that's joined us that would like to chat with us? Once, twice, 3 times. Okay. With that, our next policy meeting is October 15th from 3:30 to 5:30 in this room. And on the agenda will be policy JLF, child abuse and neglect, and policy DJA, procurement. So we look forward to that. Good?
All good.
All right. We are formally adjourned at 4:54 p.m. Thank you all.